The gunshot echoed through the narrow canyon just as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, and by the time the townspeople of Silverton, Colorado reached the small cabin 3 miles outside town, they found Margaret Flynn standing over her husband's body with a smoking revolver in her trembling hand. It was the autumn of 1876, and the Mountain Territory had seen its share of violence, but when a woman killed her own husband, that was something different entirely. The mining town buzzed with speculation and judgment before Margaret had even been dragged into the small jailhouse on Main Street. She was 24 years old, dark-haired and pale-faced, with bruises on her wrists that nobody seemed particularly interested in examining. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and there was blood spattered across her apron. But the crowd that gathered outside the sheriff's office only saw one thing: a murderer. "She killed Thomas Flynn in cold blood," declared Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the banker's wife, her voice dripping with self-righteous fury. "That woman should hang for what she did." The other townswomen nodded, their faces set in hard lines. Thomas Flynn had been well-liked in Silverton, or at least well-known. He worked claims with several other miners, drank at the saloon most evenings, and attended church on Sundays with Margaret at his side. Nobody wanted to consider what happened behind the closed door of that isolated cabin, because that would complicate the simple narrative they preferred. Sheriff Coleman was a tired man in his 50s who had seen enough of human nature to be wary of snap judgments, but he also knew how to read a crowd. He locked Margaret in the single cell at the back of his office and sent word to the territorial judge in Denver. It would be weeks before any official proceedings could take place, which meant Margaret would sit in that cell while the town worked itself into a frenzy around her. "Did he hurt you?" the sheriff asked quietly, standing outside the bars after the crowd had dispersed. Margaret sat on the thin mattress, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the stone floor. "Does it matter?" "It might." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "When has it ever mattered, Sheriff? A man's word against his wife's, except now the man is dead and cannot speak, so I suppose that makes me doubly damned." Sheriff Coleman sighed and returned to his desk. He knew she was right. He had seen the bruises, the old scars on her arms when her sleeves rode up. He had heard Thomas Flynn's voice raised in anger more than once when he passed their cabin on patrol. But knowing something and proving it were different matters, and the law was rarely kind to women who took matters into their own hands. 3 days after Margaret's arrest, a man rode into Silverton on a massive roan horse, leading a pack mule laden with furs. He was broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair that hung past his collar and a thick beard that obscured most of his face. His arms were heavy with muscle, his hands scarred from hard work and harder living. He wore buckskin pants and a worn leather coat, and he carried a rifle across his back with the ease of someone who never went anywhere without it. His name was Nathaniel Cross, though most people just called him Cross, and he made his living trapping in the high country above Silverton. Cross came to town maybe 4 times a year to trade his furs and stock up on supplies. He was not a sociable man, but he was honest and fair in his dealings, and the shopkeepers were always glad to see him, because his furs were prime quality. He tied his horse outside the general store and went inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Afternoon, Cross," said Mr. Henderson, the store owner. "Got some fine pelts there, I see." "Fair season," Cross replied, his voice deep and rough from disuse. He did not waste words. As Henderson examined the furs, 2 women entered the store, and Cross recognized them as the banker's wife and her friend, both dressed in their Sunday best despite it being a Wednesday. They ignored Cross entirely, which suited him fine, and began talking in voices just loud enough to ensure everyone could hear. "It is an abomination that she still breathes," Mrs. Thornton said. "Thomas Flynn was a good Christian man, and that woman murdered him in his own home." "I heard she did not even try to deny it," the other woman replied. "Just stood there with the gun like she was proud of what she had done." Cross sorted through bags of cornmeal and coffee, half listening. Murder in a mining town was not particularly unusual, but something about the women's venomous tone caught his attention. "Sheriff Coleman seems reluctant to do his duty," Mrs. Thornton continued. "If it were up to me, we would not wait for the judge. A rope and a tall tree would serve justice well enough." Henderson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, Abigail, let us not talk of lynching. The law will handle it." "The law," she scoffed. "The law is too slow and too soft on murderers." Cross turned from the shelf, his expression unreadable. "Who did she kill?" The women looked at him as if noticing him for the first time, their faces registering disapproval at his rough appearance. "Her husband," Mrs. Thornton said coldly. "Margaret Flynn shot Thomas in cold blood 3 nights ago." "Did she say why? Does it matter why?" "Murder is murder, Mr. Cross." He held her gaze for a long moment, then turned back to his shopping. "Reckon it might matter," Mrs. Thornton huffed indignantly and swept out of the store with her companion in tow. Henderson shook his head as he tallied up Cross's purchases. "Town is all worked up about it. Margaret was always a quiet girl, kept to herself mostly. Nobody saw this coming." "The husband," Cross said. "What kind of man was he?" Henderson hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "Thomas Flynn was... he had a temper, especially when he had been drinking, which was often. But he was popular enough, and Margaret never complained." He paused, then added more quietly, "Least not where anyone would listen." Cross paid for his supplies and walked out into the afternoon sunlight. He could have loaded up and ridden back into the mountains right then. Whatever had happened between Thomas Flynn and his wife was none of his concern. He had learned long ago that staying out of other people's troubles was the safest way to live. But something nagged at him, some instinct he had developed during his years alone in the wilderness. The same instinct that told him when a storm was coming or when a trail was dangerous. He found himself walking toward the sheriff's office instead of returning to his horse. Sheriff Coleman looked up from his paperwork when Cross entered, a flicker of surprise crossing his weathered face. "Cross, surprised to see you. You usually head back up the mountain same day you come down." "Heard about the woman who killed her husband." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying the mountain man with shrewd eyes. "You and everyone else in this territory. What is your interest?" "Heard the townfolk are eager to see her hang." "They are." Coleman rubbed his face tiredly. "Between you and me, I'm not sure it is that simple, but try telling that to a crowd that has already made up its mind." "Can I see her?" The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Why?" Cross was silent for a moment, then shrugged. "Because every time I have seen a whole town agree on something that fast, they were usually wrong." Coleman considered this, then stood and pulled a key ring from his desk drawer. 5 minutes. And if she does not want to talk to you, you leave her be." The cell at the back of the office was small and dim, with one narrow window set high in the wall. Margaret sat on the edge of the cot, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked up when she heard footsteps, and her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the large, bearded man standing outside the bars. "Mrs. Flynn," Cross said, his voice gentler than his appearance might suggest. "My name is Nathaniel Cross. I just heard about what happened." "Come to gawk at the murderer?" Her voice was flat, drained of emotion. "No, ma'am. Came to hear your side of it." She laughed bitterly. "My side does not matter. Nobody wants to hear it." "I do." Margaret studied him for a long moment, this strange mountain man with his rough clothes and steady eyes. There was something in his face that was different from the judgment she had seen in everyone else. Not pity, exactly, but something closer to understanding. "Why?" she asked finally. Cross moved closer to the bars but did not touch them, keeping a respectful distance. "Because I have lived alone in these mountains for 8 years, and one thing I have learned is that the truth is usually more complicated than people want it to be. And because those women in the general store were talking about you like you were already convicted, and that did not sit right with me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough over the past 3 days, alone in this cell with nothing but her thoughts and the weight of what she had done. "Thomas was drunk," she said quietly. "He had been drinking since noon, and when he came home, he was in a rage about something at the mine. A dispute with another prospector, I think, though he never made much sense when he was that far gone." Cross listened without interrupting, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "He started in on me the moment he walked through the door, calling me names, accusing me of things that made no sense. I had learned over the years to stay quiet when he was like that, to wait it out until he passed out or wore himself down." Her voice trembled slightly. But that night, something was different. He was worse than I had ever seen him. He hit me, knocked me to the floor, and then he— She stopped, swallowing hard. You do not have to say more, Cross said quietly. He had hurt me before, Margaret continued, as if she had not heard him. But never like that. Never with that look in his eyes, like he wanted to kill me. I managed to get away from him, and I ran for the gun we kept above the door. Thomas came at me and I fired. I did not think. I just pulled the trigger because I knew if I did not, he would beat me to death. The cell was silent except for the sound of her ragged breathing. Cross looked at her bruised wrists, the fading marks on her throat that he could see now in the dim light, and he felt a cold anger settle in his chest. That is saving yourself, he said. Not murder. Try telling that to the judge, or to this town. Margaret wiped at her eyes. Thomas had friends here. I'm just his wife, or I was. Nobody's going to believe me over his reputation. Sheriff does. She glanced toward the door that led to the front office. Sheriff Coleman has been kind, but kindness will not change what happens to me. The law does not look favorably on wives who kill their husbands, no matter the reason. Cross was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he said, What if someone testified on your behalf? Someone who could speak to your character and to what kind of man Thomas really was. Who would do that? Everyone here either liked Thomas or was afraid of him, and I have no family, no one who would stand up for me. You have me, Margaret stared at him in disbelief. You do not even know me. Why would you risk your reputation, such as it is, for a stranger? Cross met her eyes steadily. Because what happened to you was not right, and because somebody needs to say so. I have lived outside this town's good opinion for years, and I have no plans to start courting it now. My word might not count for much, but it will count for something, and it is better than nothing. For the first time since her arrest, Margaret felt something other than despair. It was a small, fragile thing, this unexpected kindness from a stranger, but it was enough to make her sit up straighter and take a deeper breath. Thank you, she whispered, even if it changes nothing. Thank you for believing me. Cross nodded and turned to leave, then paused. It will change something, Mrs. Flynn. I give you my word. Over the following days, Cross did not return to the mountains as planned. Instead, he took a room at the boarding house and began asking questions. He was not a subtle man by nature, but he knew how to observe, how to wait and listen. He spent time in the saloon, nursing whiskey and letting the miners talk. He visited the claims where Thomas Flynn had worked, speaking with the men who had known him. And slowly, a picture began to emerge that was very different from the one the townswomen were painting. Thomas Flynn had been a violent drunk who owed money to half the men in Silverton. He had been involved in several fights over the years, and more than one prospector admitted, after enough whiskey, that Thomas had a mean streak a mile wide. There were stories about livestock he had mistreated, about claims he had tried to jump, and about women he had bothered in town when Margaret was not around. None of it was admissible in a court of law, but it painted a picture that Cross felt compelled to share. He returned to the sheriff's office on the 5th day and laid out what he had learned. Sheriff Coleman listened carefully, making notes. This is helpful, the sheriff said, but it is still her word against a dead man's, and the fact remains that she shot him. In self-defense, which she will have to prove. Cross, I appreciate what you are trying to do, but the law in these matters is complicated. Even if we can establish that Thomas was abusive, it does not automatically mean Margaret will walk free. The judge will have to weigh a lot of factors. Then we make sure he has all the factors to weigh, Cross said stubbornly. Are there any other women in this town who might have experienced Thomas Flynn's temper? Coleman shifted uncomfortably. There are rumors. Sarah Mitchell, who used to work at the restaurant before she left town suddenly last year. Some said Thomas had taken an unwanted interest in her, but nothing was ever proven. Where is she now? Denver, last I heard, working at a hotel there. Cross stood. Then I will go to Denver and find her. The sheriff blinked. That's a 2-day ride, Cross, and she might not want to talk, especially about something that could put her in the middle of a trial. I will make the ride anyway, and I will ask. She has the right to refuse, but she also has the right to know that her testimony could save an innocent woman's life. Before the sheriff could respond, Cross turned and walked toward the cells. Margaret was sitting by the small window, trying to catch what little light filtered through. She looked thinner than she had days ago, and there were dark circles under her eyes. "Mrs. Flynn," Cross said, and she turned quickly. "I'm going to Denver to find someone who might be willing to speak on your behalf. I will be gone a few days, but I will be back before the judge arrives." Margaret stood and approached the bars, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "You do not have to do this. You have already done more than anyone else would." "I know I do not have to. I want to." He hesitated, then added, "When I come back, we are going to make sure the truth comes out. All of it." "Mr. Cross," Margaret said softly, "why are you doing this? Truly?" He considered the question carefully. "I spent most of my life up in those mountains because I did not much care for how people treat each other down here. But every now and then, I am reminded that there are still things worth fighting for. You deserve better than what this town is ready to give you, and I aim to see that you get it." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different. "I do not know how to thank you." "Stay strong. That is thanks enough." Cross left Silverton at dawn the next morning, pushing his horse hard across the rough terrain toward Denver. The journey took him through mountain passes and along narrow trails that would have been treacherous for a less experienced rider, but Cross knew this country like he knew his own breath. He traveled through the day and into the night, stopping only to rest his horse and catch a few hours of sleep before pushing on again. Denver was a sprawling city compared to Silverton, bustling with commerce and crowded with people seeking their fortunes in the territorial mining boom. Cross felt immediately uncomfortable in the press of humanity, but he had a purpose, and he would not let his discomfort deter him. He found the hotel where Sarah Mitchell supposedly worked and asked after her at the front desk. The clerk eyed him suspiciously, taking in his rough appearance and the rifle he carried. "Who is asking?" "Name is Nathaniel Cross. I am here from Silverton on a matter concerning Thomas Flynn." At the mention of that name, the clerk's expression changed. "Wait here." 10 minutes later, a young woman emerged from a back room. She was perhaps 22, with auburn hair and wary green eyes. "I am Sarah Mitchell. The clerk said you are from Silverton, and you mentioned Thomas Flynn." "Yes, ma'am. Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Sarah glanced around the busy lobby, then nodded toward a small sitting room off to the side. Once they were alone, she crossed her arms defensively. "What do you want? If Thomas sent you to harass me, you can tell him I will go to the police." "Thomas Flynn is dead," Cross said bluntly. "His wife shot him 5 days ago, and she is sitting in a jail cell waiting for a judge to decide her fate. The town wants to hang her for murder, but I believe she was defending herself against a violent man. I'm trying to establish what kind of person Thomas really was, and I was told you might have information that could help." Sarah's face went pale, and she sank into a chair. "He is dead?" "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting in her lap. Then she said, "I worked at Miller's restaurant in Silverton last year. Thomas would come in sometimes for supper, usually alone. He started paying attention to me, making comments, trying to get me to meet him after my shift. I always refused. I knew he was married, and besides, there was something about him that frightened me." Cross listened intently. "One night he waited for me outside after the restaurant closed. He had been drinking. He cornered me in the alley and tried to—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "I fought him off and ran. I left town the next day and never went back. I was too afraid, and I knew nobody would believe me over him. Would you be willing to testify to that? To tell a judge what he tried to do?" Sarah looked at him with frightened eyes. "Why should I? I built a new life here, away from all that. Going back there, standing up in front of everyone and talking about what happened, it would destroy me." "Not more than it will destroy Margaret Flynn if nobody speaks up," Cross said. "She is in that cell because she did what you did not have to do. She fought back, and now she's paying the price for it. Your testimony could be the difference between her walking free and her hanging. You do not understand what you are asking. I do understand. I am asking you to be brave when it is hard, to stand up for someone who cannot stand up for herself. I am asking you to do the right thing, even though it will cost you." Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street. Cross waited, letting her think. Finally, she turned back to him, her jaw set with determination. "I will do it," she said quietly. "I will testify. If Margaret Flynn had the courage to fight back, the least I can do is tell the truth about what kind of man her husband was. Cross felt relief wash over him. Thank you, Miss Mitchell. The judge should arrive in Silverton within the week. I will send word of the exact date. They made arrangements for Sarah to travel to Silverton, and Cross left Denver that afternoon, riding hard back toward the mountains. He felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since this whole situation began. Sarah's testimony, combined with what the miners had told him and the evidence of Margaret's injuries, might be enough to convince a judge that she had acted in self-defense. But he arrived back in Silverton late on the second day, exhausted and trail-worn. His first stop was the sheriff's office, where he found Coleman reviewing documents by lamplight. "You're back," the sheriff said. "Did you find her?" "I did. She will come to testify." Coleman's eyebrows rose. "She agreed? What did she say?" Cross recounted his conversation with Sarah Mitchell, and the sheriff listened with growing interest. When Cross finished, Coleman leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. "That is good work, Cross. It might not be enough to guarantee Margaret walks free, but it is a hell of a lot more than she had before you got involved. The judge is due to arrive in 3 days. I will make sure he hears all of this." "I want to see her," Cross said. "Let her know what happened." The sheriff handed him the keys. "Go ahead." "I think you have earned the right." Cross walked to the back cell, his footsteps heavy with fatigue. Margaret was lying on the cot staring at the ceiling, but she sat up quickly when she saw him. "You are back," she breathed. "Did you find her?" "I did. Sarah Mitchell agreed to testify about what Thomas tried to do to her. It is not everything, but it is a start." Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, and tears streamed down her face. "Oh my God, I cannot believe she would do that. I cannot believe you did this." Cross unlocked the cell door, and Margaret looked at him in confusion. The sheriff called from the front room. "It is all right. I trust him." Cross stepped into the cell and sat down on the wooden chair in the corner, keeping a respectful distance. Up close, he could see the full extent of her injuries. To the bruises that were turning yellow and green as they healed, the split lip that was still mending. His jaw tightened with anger at the man who had done this to her. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Margaret wiped at her tears. "Better now. Before you came along, I had accepted that I was going to hang. I had made my peace with it because I knew what I did was right, even if nobody else would see it that way. But now, maybe there is a chance." She looked at him with wonder in her eyes. "Why did you do all this? You could have just ridden back into your mountains and forgotten about me." Cross was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. The truth was complicated, woven from threads of justice and loneliness, and something else he was not quite ready to name. "I've been alone for a long time," he said finally. "It's 8 years in the high country with nobody but myself for company. I chose that life because I got tired of seeing people hurt each other, tired of watching the strong prey on the weak while everyone else looked away. But when I heard about what happened to you, about how quick this town was to condemn you without asking questions, it reminded me that looking away is its own kind of sin. You are a good man, Nathaniel Cross. I am just a man who has seen enough injustice to recognize it when it is right in front of me." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Tell me about your life, Margaret, before all this, before Thomas." She seemed surprised by the question, but after a moment she began to talk. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about losing her parents to cholera when she was 16, about coming west with an aunt who died within a year of arriving in Colorado. She had been alone and desperate when she met Thomas Flynn, and he had seemed kind at first, attentive and generous. They married within 3 months, and by then she had already begun to see glimpses of his temper. But it was too late. She had nowhere else to go, no family to return to, no money of her own. "The first time he hit me was 6 months after the wedding," she said quietly. "He apologized afterward, said it would never happen again. But it did happen again. And again. Until I stopped being surprised by it. I just learned to survive, to stay out of his way when he was drinking, to hide the bruises where nobody would see them." Cross listened to all of it, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When she finished, he said, You do not have to go back to that life. After this is over, after the trial, you will be free to choose your own path. If I am not hanged." You will not be hanged. I will make sure of it." There was something in his voice, a fierce certainty that made Margaret believe him. She studied his face, this rough mountain man with his scarred hands and gentle eyes, and felt something shift inside her. It was too soon to call it affection, too fragile to examine too closely, but it was there nonetheless. A warmth, a connection, a sense that she was no longer alone in her fight. "Tell me about the mountains," she said softly. "Tell me about your life up there." So Cross did. He told her about his cabin tucked into a valley where few people ever ventured. About the long winters when snow piled higher than the windows, and the only sounds were wind and wildlife. He told her about trapping and hunting, about the satisfaction of living by his own hands and his own wits. He told her about the sunrise over the peaks and the way the stars looked when there were no town lights to dim them. Margaret listened with rapt attention, painting pictures in her mind of a life so different from her own. "It sounds lonely," she said. "It is, but it is also peaceful. After years of war and violence, peace seemed worth the loneliness." "You were in the war," Cross nodded. "Fought for the Union, saw enough death to last several lifetimes. When it was over, I wanted to get as far away from people and their conflicts as I could. The mountains gave me that." "Do you ever regret it? The isolation?" He considered the question carefully. "Sometimes. There are moments when the silence feels like too much, when I remember what it was like to have friends, to be part of something larger than myself. But then I come to town and see how people treat each other, and I remember why I left." "Not all people are cruel," Margaret said softly. "No," Cross agreed, meeting her eyes. "Not all." They talked late into the night, their conversation flowing easily despite the strangeness of the circumstances. Sheriff Coleman eventually appeared and told Cross he needed to lock up for the night, but there was a knowing look in his eyes as he watched the mountain man reluctantly leave the cell. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah Mitchell arrived from Denver, and Cross met her at the stage. She was nervous but resolute, and he escorted her to the boarding house where she would stay until the trial. Word spread through town that the mountain man was gathering witnesses for Margaret Flynn's defense, and the gossip grew more heated. Some people thought it was admirable, others thought he was wasting his time on a lost cause, and still others muttered darkly about outsiders interfering in town business. Cross ignored all of it. He spent his time with Sheriff Coleman, going over the evidence and the testimony they would present. He visited Margaret each day, bringing her better food than the thin gruel the jail usually provided, and spending hours talking with her. With each conversation, he felt himself drawn deeper into her orbit. She was intelligent and strong, with a quiet dignity that her circumstances had not broken. She laughed at his rough humor and listened to his stories with genuine interest, and he found himself thinking about her constantly when he was not by her side. On the morning of the trial, Judge Harold Blackwood arrived from Denver. He was a stern-faced man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness, but also for adhering strictly to the letter of the law. The trial would be held in the church, the only building large enough to accommodate the crowd that was certain to gather. Cross helped Margaret walk from the jail to the church, his hand steady on her elbow. She wore a clean dress that one of the kinder townswomen had donated, and her hair was pulled back in a simple bun. She looked pale but composed, her spine straight despite the weight of what lay ahead. The church was packed, every pew was filled, and people stood along the walls and in the back, craning for a view. The atmosphere was charged, anticipatory. Cross sat in the front row, his presence a solid, reassuring bulk that Margaret could see from the defendant's chair. Judge Blackwood called the proceedings to order, and the prosecution began. The territorial prosecutor was a thin man named Hastings, who laid out the facts in stark terms. Margaret Flynn had shot and killed her husband Thomas Flynn with a revolver. There was no dispute about the facts of the death itself. The question was whether it constituted murder or something else. Hastings called several witnesses who testified to Thomas Flynn's good character, men who had worked with him and drank with him, who painted a picture of a hard-working prospector with normal vices. None of them mentioned his temper or his drinking, and Cross felt his jaw tighten with frustration. Then it was time for the defense. Sheriff Coleman stood and called his first witness, Margaret Flynn herself. Margaret took the stand with visible trembling, but her voice was steady as she swore to tell the truth. Coleman asked her to describe the events of that night, and she did, her words painting a vivid picture of terror and desperation. She described Thomas's drinking, his rage, the beating that had left her bruised and bleeding. She described grabbing the gun in a moment of sheer survival instinct, pulling the trigger because she knew he was going to kill her. "Did you want to kill your husband?" Coleman asked. "No," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted to live. That's all. I just wanted to live." Hastings cross-examined her aggressively, trying to poke holes in her story, suggesting she could have run away, could have called for help, could have done anything other than pull that trigger. But Margaret held firm, her answers consistent and clear. Then Coleman called Sarah Mitchell to the stand. The courtroom buzzed with surprise as the young woman from Denver took her seat. She was visibly nervous, her hands shaking, but her voice was clear as she told her story. She described Thomas Flynn's unwanted advances, the night he had cornered her in the alley, the fear that had driven her to flee Silverton. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Cross saw doubt beginning to creep into faces that had been set with certainty before. Finally, Coleman called Nathaniel Cross to the stand. Cross stood and walked to the front, his size and presence commanding the room's attention. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore his oath, then sat down and faced the judge. "Mr. Cross," Coleman began, "you are not from Silverton, correct?" "No, sir. I live in the high country. Come to town maybe 4 times a year to trade." "Why did you involve yourself in this case?" Cross looked directly at Judge Blackwood. "Because I heard people calling for Margaret Flynn's death before anyone had bothered to ask what really happened." "I have lived alone for 8 years, Your Honor, and one thing you learn when you spend that much time by yourself is how to see clearly without all the noise of other people's opinions clouding your judgment. So I looked into Thomas Flynn's character, and I did not like what I found." He went on to describe the conversations he had had with minors, the stories of Thomas's violence and cruelty, the debts and the fights. He spoke plainly and without embellishment, and his words carried weight precisely because he had no personal stake in the outcome beyond a desire to see justice done. When Hastings tried to discredit him, suggesting he barely knew Margaret and therefore could not speak to her character, Cross looked at him steadily and said, "I know enough to recognize an innocent woman when I see one, and I know enough to recognize a town that would rather hang her than admit they turned a blind eye to her suffering for years." The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs, and Judge Blackwood had to bang his gavel for order. But Cross's words had struck a nerve. Thus, and several people looked ashamed. After closing arguments, Judge Blackwood retired to consider his verdict. The wait was agonizing. Cross stood outside the church with Margaret, who was pale and shaking. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "thank you for everything." "Nothing is going to happen except you walking out of here a free woman," Cross said firmly. An hour later, Judge Blackwood returned. The crowd filed back into the church, and Margaret took her place before the bench. Cross held his breath. "I have considered all the testimony and evidence presented today," the judge began, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "The law regarding a wife's right to defend herself against her husband is complex and, frankly, inadequate. However, based on the evidence of sustained abuse, the testimony regarding Thomas Flynn's violent character, and the clear indication that Mrs. Flynn believed her life to be in imminent danger, I find that she acted in self-defense." The courtroom exploded with noise, some people cheering, others shouting in protest. Judge Blackwood banged his gavel again. "Margaret Flynn, you are free to go. This court is adjourned." Margaret's knees buckled, and Cross caught her before she fell. She turned her face into his chest and sobbed, great heaving cries of relief and release. He held her gently, his arms a protective circle around her shaking form, and let her cry. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and tear-stained but transformed by a smile. "I am free," she whispered. "I am actually free." "You are," Cross confirmed, smiling back at her. Over the following days, Margaret stayed at the boarding house while she figured out what to do next. The cabin she had shared with Thomas held nothing but bad memories, and she had no desire to return there. She had almost no money and no prospects, but she had something more valuable: freedom and choice. Cross remained in Silverton as well, ostensibly to rest his horse and resupply, but really because he could not bring himself to leave yet. He and Margaret spent hours together, walking through town and talking about everything and nothing. He showed her the mountains from a distance, pointing out the peaks he knew and the trails he traveled. She told him about her dreams, the things she had wanted to do before her marriage had trapped her in a cage of fear and violence. "What will you do now?" he asked one evening as they sat on a bench outside the boarding house, watching the sun set over the jagged horizon. "I do not know," Margaret admitted. "I've been thinking about it constantly, but I have no skills beyond keeping house, and I have no desire to find another husband to support me." "You do not need a husband to survive," Cross said. "You are strong enough to build your own life." "Maybe, but I do not know where to start." Cross was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "You could come with me, up to the mountains." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "What?" "My cabin is small but solid. There is game to hunt and clean water and space to breathe. You would not have to worry about money or gossip or any of the things that have been weighing on you. You could just exist for a while, until you figure out what you want." He hesitated, then added, "I would like the company, if I'm being honest, and I think you might benefit from some peace and quiet." Margaret's heart was racing. The offer was unexpected and audacious and more tempting than anything she had ever been offered. "You barely know me," she said softly. "I know enough. I know you are brave and kind and stronger than you give yourself credit for. I know I want to spend more time with you, get to know you better. But there is no pressure, Margaret. If you would rather stay in town or go somewhere else entirely, I will understand." She looked at him, this mountain man who had upended his own life to save hers, and felt something click into place. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will come with you." Cross's face broke into a rare, genuine smile. "Oh, yeah?" "Yeah," she confirmed, laughing at his expression. "When do we leave?" They departed Silverton 2 days later, after Margaret had sold what little she owned and said her farewells. Sarah Mitchell had already returned to Denver, but not before embracing Margaret and telling her to be happy. Sheriff Coleman shook Cross's hand and told him he was a good man, which Cross accepted with his usual gruff modesty. The journey into the mountains took most of a day, following narrow trails that climbed steadily higher. Margaret rode the mule while Cross led on his horse, pointing out landmarks and warning her about dangerous sections of the path. The air grew thinner and cooler, and the trees changed from scrubby pines to tall, ancient evergreens that blocked out much of the sky. They reached Cross's cabin just before nightfall. It was exactly as he had described, small but solid, built from thick logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Inside was a single large room with a fireplace, a bed in one corner, a table and chairs, and shelves lined with supplies. It was sparse but clean, and there was something undeniably cozy about it. "It is not much," Cross said, suddenly self-conscious. "It is perfect," Margaret replied, looking around with genuine pleasure. "It feels safe." That first night, Cross gave Margaret the bed and made himself a pallet on the floor by the fire. She protested, but he insisted, saying he had spent enough nights on hard ground that one more would not hurt him. They talked late into the night, the fire crackling between them, sharing stories and dreams with an ease that felt both new and ancient. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Cross taught Margaret how to fish in the cold mountain streams and how to identify edible plants. She proved to be a quick learner, unafraid of hard work and eager to master new skills. In turn, she brought a warmth to the cabin that Cross had not realized was missing. She cooked hearty meals, mended his worn clothes, and filled the silence with her laughter and her voice. But more than that, they talked. They talked about everything, their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Margaret told him about the girl she had been before Thomas, full of dreams and ambition. Cross told her about the soldier he had been, about the friends he had lost and the reasons he had chosen isolation. They debated philosophy and politics, told silly jokes, and sat in comfortable silence when words were not needed. And slowly, inevitably, they fell in love. It happened in small moments, the way Cross's eyes softened when he looked at her, the way Margaret's hand lingered on his shoulder when she passed behind his chair, the way they found excuses to be close to each other. The cabin, which had felt spacious for one, now felt almost too small for the tension that hummed between them. One evening, about 2 months after Margaret's arrival, they were sitting on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It was late summer and the air was warm and sweet with the scent of pine. Cross was whittling a piece of wood and Margaret was mending a shirt, but both of them were more aware of each other than their tasks. "Nathaniel," Margaret said quietly, and the use of his full name made him look up. Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you ever regret bringing me here?" He set down his knife in the wood, giving her his full attention. "No, not for a single second." "Why would you ask that?" "Because I have disrupted your entire life. Your peace and solitude, the things you came up here to find. I have taken over your cabin and your routine, and I just want to make sure you do not resent me for it." Cross reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. "Margaret, you have not disrupted my life. You have made it better. Before you came, I was content but lonely. Now I am happy. Do you understand the difference?" Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I feel the same way. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Then stay," he said simply. "Not as a guest or someone passing through. Stay with me. Build a life here with me." "Nathaniel, are you asking me to marry you?" He smiled, a slow, warm expression that transformed his rugged face. "I suppose I am, though I am doing a poor job of it. I do not have a ring or fancy words, but I can promise you this. I will spend every day of my life making sure you feel safe and loved and free. I will never raise my hand to you or my voice in anger. I will respect your choices and support your dreams, and I will love you with everything I have, for as long as I live." Margaret set down her mending and moved closer to him, her free hand coming up to touch his bearded face. "Then yes, I will marry you, Nathaniel Cross. I will stay with you and build a life with you, and I will love you just as fiercely as you love me." He pulled her into his arms, and they kissed for the first time, a gentle, tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more passionate. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," Cross admitted. "So have I," Margaret laughed. "I was just waiting for you to make the first move. I was trying to be respectful, giving you time and space after everything you had been through. I appreciate that. But Nathaniel, I am not broken. Thomas hurt me, but he did not destroy me. I am ready to move forward, to have a real relationship built on trust and respect and love. I am ready for all of it." That night, they shared the bed together for the first time, holding each other close as the mountain wind whispered through the trees outside. It was the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for, a true partnership, a love built on mutual respect and genuine affection. They were married a month later in Silverton, with Sheriff Coleman serving as a witness and Sarah Mitchell traveling from Denver to attend. It was a simple ceremony in the same church where Margaret had been tried, but the symbolism was not lost on anyone. She stood in that space not as a defendant, but as a bride, choosing her own future with a man who had fought for her when no one else would. After the wedding, they returned to the mountains, and life settled into a new, deeper rhythm. Margaret thrived in the wilderness, her spirit expanding in the vast open spaces. She learned to shoot and to trap, to read the weather and the land. Cross, in turn, learned to share his life fully with another person, to compromise and communicate, to let someone see him at his most vulnerable. Their first winter together was harsh, with snow that piled to the eaves and temperatures that dropped so low the river froze solid. But inside the cabin, they were warm. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking and reading and making love, their bodies fitting together with an ease that felt inevitable. Cross marveled at the softness of her skin, the way she sighed his name, the trust she placed in him with every touch. Margaret found healing in his gentleness, in the way he always asked permission, always made sure she was comfortable and safe. Spring came eventually, as it always does, bringing with it new life and new possibilities. Margaret discovered she was pregnant in April, and the joy on Cross's face when she told him made her cry happy tears. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hand coming to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "I am sure. Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," he breathed. "Margaret, you have given me everything, a home, a purpose, love, and now a child. I do not have words for what I'm feeling." Their son was born in December, during the first major snowstorm of the winter. Cross delivered the baby himself, his hands steady despite his fear. When he placed the squalling infant on Margaret's chest, he wept openly. They named him Daniel, after Margaret's father, and he was perfect, healthy and strong with a shock of dark hair and his mother's eyes. Parenthood changed them both in ways they had not anticipated. Cross, each who had spent years trusting only himself, learned to be vulnerable in new ways, to fear for someone other than himself. Margaret, who had spent so long surviving, learned to thrive, to embrace joy without waiting for it to be snatched away. They were exhausted and overwhelmed and happier than they had ever been. As Daniel grew from a baby to a toddler, they talked about expanding the cabin, about maybe taking on some livestock, about the future they were building together. Cross still trapped and hunted, but he also began guiding wealthy men from back east who wanted to experience the wilderness. The money was good, and it allowed them to be more comfortable, to plan for Daniel's education and their own security. When Daniel was 3, Margaret became pregnant again, and this time they had a daughter they named Grace, after the grace that had brought them together. She was smaller and quieter than her brother, with her father's serious eyes and her mother's gentle nature. Cross adored both his children with a fierce devotion that sometimes surprised him. He had never imagined himself as a father, but now he could not imagine being anything else. One evening, when Daniel was 5 and Grace was 2, the family sat together on the porch watching the sunset. Daniel was playing with wooden animals Cross had carved for him, and Grace was drowsing in her mother's arms. Cross had his arm around Margaret's shoulders, and she leaned into him contentedly. "Do you ever miss town?" he asked quietly. Margaret thought about it, then shook her head. "No, everything I need is right here." Do you ever regret leaving your solitary life behind?" Cross looked at his children, at his wife, at the life they had built together in this wild, beautiful place. "Not for a single second. You gave me something I did not even know I was missing. A family, a real home. Before you, I was just existing. Now I'm living." "We saved each other," Margaret said softly. "You saved me from the gallows, and I saved you from loneliness. You did more than that. You taught me how to love again, how to trust, how to believe in the goodness of people despite everything I had seen. You gave me hope." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and somewhere in the distance, an elk bugled its mating call. "Nah, tell me again," Daniel said suddenly, looking up from his toys. "Tell me the story about how you met Mama." Cross and Margaret exchanged a smile. They had told their son a simplified version of the story before, editing out the violence and the fear, focusing instead on the courage and the love. "Well," Cross began, "a long time ago, your mama needed help, and I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. Some people in town did not understand what really happened, but I knew your mama was brave and good, so I stood up for her." "And then you fell in love?" Daniel asked, his eyes wide. "And then we fell in love," Margaret confirmed. "Your papa showed me that there were still good men in the world, men who would fight for what is right even when it is hard. He gave me a second chance at life, and we have been together ever since." "That's a good story," Daniel declared, returning to his toys. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Cross thought about how far they had come. From that day in Silverton when he first heard about the woman who had killed her husband, to this moment, surrounded by love and peace and the family they had created together. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every difficult step. Years passed and their children grew. Daniel became a strong, capable young man who inherited his father's love of the wilderness and his mother's compassionate heart. Grace grew into a thoughtful, artistic girl who could paint the mountains with stunning accuracy and who had a gift for healing injured animals. Cross and Margaret watched them with pride, knowing that they had broken the cycle of violence and pain that had threatened to define their lives. When Daniel was 16 and Grace was 13, Cross took his son on a long hunting trip, just the two of them. As they sat by the campfire one night, Daniel said, "Papa, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why did you really help Mama all those years ago? I mean, I know the story you tell, but I am old enough now to understand there must have been more to it." Cross studied his son, seeing the maturity in his face, the genuine desire to understand. "Your Mama was in a situation where everyone had already decided she was guilty. She had defended herself against a man who was hurting her, but nobody wanted to hear her side of the story. I helped her because it was the right thing to do, but also because I saw something in her, a strength and a dignity that had survived despite everything she had been through. And maybe I was tired of being alone, tired of watching from the sidelines while life happened to other people." "You loved her even then, did you not?" Cross smiled. "I think maybe I did, though I did not realize it at the time. Sometimes love creeps up on you slow, and other times it hits you like lightning. With your Mama, it was both. I knew she was special right away, but learning to love her, learning to trust that feeling, that took time. I want that someday," Daniel said quietly. "What you and Mama have, that kind of partnership. You will find it, son. Just be patient and be yourself, and the right person will come along." Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Margaret and Grace were having their own conversation. Grace had been withdrawn lately, and Margaret had been waiting for the right moment to ask why. "Mama," Grace said as they prepared dinner together, "were you scared when you had to go to trial?" Margaret paused in her chopping. They had told the children more complete versions of the story as they got older, though still carefully edited. Grace knew the basics, that her mother had been accused of a crime, that her father had defended her, that they had fallen in love through the ordeal. "I was terrified," Margaret admitted. "I thought I was going to die, and there was nothing I could do about it. But your papa refused to let that happen. He fought for me when I could not fight for myself. But you were brave too, right? You defended yourself in the first place." "I suppose I was, though at the time I did not feel brave. I just felt desperate." Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad you were brave. I'm glad you survived. Otherwise I would not be here, and neither would Daniel, and Papa would still be alone." Margaret pulled her daughter into a hug. "So am I, sweetheart. So am I." The years continued to roll past, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There were hard winters and abundant springs, illnesses that frightened them and recoveries that brought relief. Cross's parents, long estranged, reached out late in his life, and he made peace with them before they passed. Margaret never had contact with any of Thomas Flynn's family, and she was grateful for that distance. When Daniel was 21, he married a girl from Silverton, a smart, capable woman who took to mountain life with enthusiasm. They built a cabin nearby, and soon Cross and Margaret were grandparents to a healthy baby boy. Grace, meanwhile, decided she wanted to study medicine, and Cross and Margaret supported her decision despite knowing it would mean sending her to Denver for training. "She is so young," Margaret worried as they prepared to take Grace to the city. "She is strong," Cross replied. "Just like her mama, she will be fine." And Grace was fine. She thrived in her studies and eventually returned to the mountains, setting up a small practice that served the scattered families in the high country. She never married, content with her work and her family, and Cross and Margaret respected her choice without question. As Cross and Margaret entered their 50s, they began to slow down. Cross's knees ached from decades of hard living, and Margaret's hair turned silver. But they were still deeply in love, still finding joy in each other's company and in the life they had built. They spent their days tending a garden, watching their grandchildren, and enjoying the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. One evening, as they sat on their porch in the spot where they had shared so many conversations over the years, Margaret said, "I've been thinking about Sarah Mitchell lately, wondering if she ever found happiness." "I hope she did," Cross replied. "She was brave to testify like she did. She helped save your life." We should have kept in better touch with her. Life gets busy, but her courage mattered, and I hope she knows that. They sat in silence for a while, watching the familiar peaks turn gold in the fading light. Cross reached for Margaret's hand, and she laced her fingers through his, the gesture as natural as breathing. "Do you have any regrets?" Margaret asked. Cross thought about it seriously. "No. There are things I would change if I could, pain I wish we had been spared, but I would not trade the life we built together for anything. You?" "Not a single one. You gave me everything, Nathaniel. Freedom, love, family, purpose. You showed me that I was worthy of good things, that I deserved to be happy. I will never stop being grateful for that. You did the same for me. Before you, I was half alive at best. You brought me back to the world. You gave me a reason to care about something beyond my own survival." As the stars began to appear, one by one, in the vast Montana sky, they sat together in the contentment of a life well lived. They had faced down injustice and violence, fear and uncertainty, and they had emerged victorious, not through strength of arms, but through courage and love and the unwavering belief that everyone deserved a chance at happiness. Their story was not one that would be written in history books or remembered by future generations beyond their own descendants, but it was a story that mattered, a testament to the power of standing up for what is right even when it is hard, of choosing love over loneliness, of building something beautiful from the ashes of trauma and pain. When Cross passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, Margaret held his hand and whispered her love and her gratitude. She mourned him deeply but without regret, knowing that they had been blessed with decades together, that every moment had been a gift. She lived for 5 more years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and when her own time came, she went peacefully, a smile on her face. Her last words were, "Tell your papa I am coming home." Daniel and Grace, now middle-aged themselves, buried their parents side by side on the mountain they had loved, under the vast sky that had witnessed their love story. They marked the graves with simple stones, and they told their own children the story of how their grandparents had met, how love had grown from the darkest circumstances, how courage and compassion had triumphed over hatred and judgment. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines and the stars blazed overhead, it was easy to imagine that somewhere in those mountains, 2 souls were still together, still loving each other, still finding peace in the wilderness they had made their home. The woman who had been accused and the mountain man who had saved her had found something rare and precious, a love that transcended circumstance, that healed old wounds, that created a legacy of hope and courage for generations to come. Their story was a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are not dramatic gestures, but quiet stands against injustice, that love can bloom in the unlikeliest places, and that everyone deserves a chance to write their own ending. Margaret and Nathaniel had written theirs together, word by word, day by day, until they had created something beautiful and lasting, a life built on trust, respect, and an unwavering commitment to each other's happiness. In the end, that was their triumph. Not just that Margaret had been freed from the noose, but that both of them had been freed from the prisons of loneliness and fear that had confined them. Together, they had found what everyone searches for, and few truly find: a home, not just in a place, but in another person's heart. And that was the greatest freedom of all.